Hello, I'm Dylan Manley, and I am one of the regional field coordinators. I oversee Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. And today I'm going to be covering Lesson 7, The Rise of Modern Zionism. Now, the rise of modern Zionism began with a few key factors. First was in Europe, the concept of nationalism and liberalism began to emerge. Now, this is significant because liberalism first allowed the Jews in Europe to finally have a place where they could emerge from the ghettos. And this meant that they were no longer sequestered and they were beginning to assimilate into the countries in which they were living. However, nationalism followed suit. And with nationalism, the new ideology became that the Jews and their identity were once again possessed by the other countries in Europe. They began to be seen as others. In other words, they weren't considered to be part of the countries in which they were living. They were seen as simply an other part of that community. And their countries that they inhabited began to isolate and ostracize them yet again. Many Jews thought if they just rejected their Jewishness, or if they cast off some of their Jewish nature, that they would be accepted in the societies, and yet anti-Semitism continued to rise. However, this idea of nationalism really began to make the Jews think about their own homeland for the first time. A major event which crystallized some of these ideas was what's known as the Dreyfus Affair. Now, the Dreyfus Affair is an integral part of this history in Europe regarding the Jews going back to their homeland. It was a scandal that began in 1894 when Captain Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason. Now, Dreyfus was a 35-year-old French artillery officer of Jewish descent. He was falsely convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for communicating French military secrets to the German embassy in Paris, and was imprisoned on the Devil's Island in French Guiana, where he spent nearly 5 years. Now, in 1896, some new evidence came to light, and the real culprit was found as a French army major who was named Ferdinand Walsin Estrazy. And when the evidence of a military court unanimously acquitted Estrazy after a trial lasting only 2 days, Dreyfus remained in prison. In 1899, Dreyfus was finally returned to France for a second trial, and the new trial resulted in another conviction and a 10-year sentence. But Dreyfus was pardoned and released, and in 1906, he was exonerated and reinstated as a major in the French army. This event made a massive impact throughout Europe and the Jewish community, but in particular, it made a huge impact on a man named Theodor Herzl. He was convinced that there would never be a place that was fully protective of the Jews in Europe from anti-Semitism, and so the Jews needed to go and be in their own state, this place that they were the nationality, the place where they called their home, something that belonged to them. And he began to organize the first Zionist Congress. His friend, who was also a Christian pastor, William Heckler, was also helpful and wrote a pamphlet which expressed that Israel was in fact the promised land that was promised to the Jews. The Jews in Eastern Europe began to experience even more restrictions, however. Over 5 million Jews were living in extreme poverty in Eastern Europe in the late 1800s. These were the Ashkenazi Jews. They were expelled from major cities under Russian rule and lived entirely in poor Jewish communities. Now, although poverty-stricken, they were at least allowed to practice their religion, traditions, language, and so there was actually some vibrant expressions of their Jewish nature being seen and also emerging. But this all changed in 1881 when Alexander III enacted the May Laws, which restricted where Jews could live, forced the boys into Russian military at age 12, and violent attacks were common against them. Afterward, 2.25 million Jews came to America from Russia. The Jewish immigration began buying land from the Ottoman Empire as well at the same time. And a man named Pinsker believed that this would only cease, this anti-Semitism in Russia and anti-Semitism in Europe, when the Jews had their own land. And so the Jewish people began buying land from the Ottoman Empire, and the next decade saw even more Jews flee from Eastern Europe and Tel Aviv became the first all-Jewish city in modern history.